Well, hey, Waspeteers, it's your old pal, King Waspinator. Welcome back to Total Party Skills. Often one of the most overlooked aspects of the world of darkness, which is kind of strange considering like how out front it is with the concept, is that in these games you are playing monsters. Not misunderstood monsters, monsters. White Wolf player characters are bad guys. The characters from Werewolf the Apocalypse, no exception at all. Of course, they frame themselves as being great heroic beings who are out to save the world against insurmountable odds and all that kind of stuff, but many of their problems are actually really originally of their own making, and their arrogance dooms them and all around them. I'm going to start off with what I would consider to be the 5 worst Geru tribes of the Western Concordiate. By worst, I don't mean having like the lamest concept or having the weakest powers. By worst, I mean these are the 5 tribes that arguably undermine the stated goals and intentions of the Western Concordiate Alliance of Tribes and their ongoing centuries-old struggle against the worm. And so, no particular order, I'm going to start off with the Black Furies. You know, they pop up very first in the book. They're the all-female, mostly asterisk tribe. Now, since the time the 20th anniversary Werewolf the Apocalypse came out, we've had a few little shifts in what is considered culturally acceptable, so it's still going by this particular iteration of the Black Furies. I guess you can kind of accuse them of being the TERFs of Werewolf the Apocalypse. The only males they allow in to the tribe are their own Metis offspring. Obviously, you can go the Ginger Snaps route and say that there is, you know, like some analogies for female werewolves and the Black Furies in general, of it kind of being like an analogy for female puberty and the changes that come with every full moon. But, you know, it applies to werewolves across the line, and it's not like there's not female werewolves in all the other tribes. It's not like all female werewolves have to be Black Furies. Also, it's easy to fall into the idea that, you know, they're man-hating werewolf ladies who don't need no wolf man kind of shit going on, and you know, there is certainly that aspect to them, but that's not all of them. I mean, they are, you know, carrying on just like an ancient tradition of warrior ladies to some degree or another. Problem with them, and why probably I get them out of the way first, because they might be the mildest in this, but a theme amongst all 5 of the tribes I'm going to be talking about in this video is the purity angle that a lot of them have, for one thing or another. For the Black Furies, of course, it's this absolute rejection of the male side of their bloodlines, which, you know, reduces their effectiveness as a combat unit, not because male werewolves are any necessarily better at being werewolfy. Krynos is fairly gender neutral when it comes to werewolf combat and all that kind of stuff. However, it's a numbers game, kind of to say. The Black Furies, like, just overall are a smaller tribe than they should be, because they're not allowing up to 50% of their own kinfolk who go through the transformation to join their ranks. And even when they keep the Metis around, they're not, you know, doing it just out of love of the kid. It's other tribes aren't generally interested in taking people's Metis offspring, and it's also kind of almost like a guilt reminder. It's like punishment, having to raise and keep this kid around as a reminder that, you know, hey, don't get drunk and fuck other werewolves, kind of a thing. Next up, I'll jump into the Get of Fenris. In the modern version of 20th Anniversary Edition, they've toned it down somewhat, but there's always been kind of an angle with the Get of Fenris that could arguably, especially in modern times, make them among the more controversial tribes. You know, they are Germanic, Scandinavian, and very focused on being warlike and racial purity and all that. So, you know, going back to the thing about how these were never supposed to be good guys in a way, the werewolf characters delude themselves into thinking they're heroes. But, you know, you have a whole tribe that, in its initial conception, is basically like a neo-Nazi tribe. And like I said, they've kind of try to pull back from that in the decade since and give them a bit more of like a Viking flavor and all that. But the Getafenris are what the Getafenris are. I'll also put the Silverfangs on this list. As the leaders of the Western Concordiate, once again self-appointed, with their focus on the having purebred noble werewolf bloodlines, causing to a lot of inbreeding amongst their leadership, and not to mention just the centuries of questionably bad leadership taking over other people's territories because they're the Silverfangs. Of course, they get the best of everything. And like a lot of the mistakes that the Geru in general have made can be laid at the Silverfang's feet. I'm not necessarily advocating that the Shadow Lords would be a better replacement. In many ways, I would say the tribe that should be in charge of the Western Concordiate and coordinating all the various tribes in their efforts should be the Children of Gaia, but obviously that's not going to happen. Fourth up, I'm going to put Wendigo. They're basically the Native American version of the Getafenris. They're very focused on maintaining like they're an all purely North American bloodline tribe of the original indigenous North American populations, which is all well and good for wanting to preserve a cultural heritage and yada yada yada, but the werewolves as a whole have this much larger stated goal, and a failure for several of these tribes to let go of their old cultural baggage stands in the way of them ever being able to all be on the same page properly and work towards something. They are their own worst enemies because of so many of them having these kinds of cultural identity hang-ups. There's others that are not on this list that do the same as well, beyond just the Getafenris and the Russian Silverfangs and the Greek Black Furies. There's also Eastern European Shadow Lords, Uktena and Children of Gaia, Glasswalkers. They're all pretty good about kind of spreading themselves up into different populations and not being quite so ethnically attached. The Fianna are kind of like the Irish equivalent of the Getafenris, but those tribes have other things going on, and they're not quite so intense and insisting on no, you can only have sex with people who look like this so that your kids look like this and have X ancestry. The Wendigo being stuck on that tip, whereas some people might find them a bit more sympathetic than the Getafenris. They still suffer from the exact same mental problem in that regard. And finally on this list, the Red Talons. Of the tribes on this list, the Red Talons are actually among my favorite tribes. However, being frankly honest about their concept, as instead of being really overly attached to a specific human ethnicity, they're just really attached to the fact that they don't like having human bloodlines amongst their tribe at all. They're purely of the lupus origin, and arguably, they're getting kind of closer and closer to just being another substitute for black spiral dancers. They might not be overtly villainous towards other werewolves, but their attitudes towards human and human kinfolk ranks them right up there with some of the more the older mid-20th century Getafenris that were out and about in Central Europe at the time, let's say. So, as I say, these are the 5 tribes that probably do the most damage to the efforts of the Geru nation as a whole. And in order for them to be able to all get on the same page and coordinate themselves and actually get any movement towards accomplishing their goals to varying degrees, obviously. As I said, of this list, the Black Furies are probably the most sinless. It's more they're just kind of by being stubborn on this, they're kind of giving themselves a tactical disadvantage by reducing the overall size of their tribe. It also cuts out people who should be their kinfolk, because if you send your male son off to join another tribe, anyone that male son breeds with, their offspring, even if they're not werewolves, become kinfolk. But now that kinfolk might be ranked as a Children of Gaia kinfolk instead of a Black Fury kinfolk. It's just short-sighted. And as far as the turf thing, is just the way they're written, I just don't really see the Black Furies, even if they're not, I don't need no Wolfman type of people. I don't really see them readily accepting trans woman werewolves amongst them. That's more something you probably would see with Uktena and maybe a couple other tribes, but I don't really think that's the Black Furies things. So yeah, I guess there you go. the five worst werewolf tribes? Apparently, the fifth edition, quote-unquote, of Werewolf that's going to be being put out by Renegade Studios is removing Metis from the setting entirely. Now, going through the matrix of modern-day entertainment and what is considered verboten and what is not, we can, of course, see why they don't want to have a aspect of character creation where one of your options is you're playing someone who's been cursed to suffer from some sort of physical or mental malady in the form of, various physical disabilities or neurological disabilities as, a kind of a cosmic punishment for the sinful behavior of werewolf parents who decide to breed with other werewolves. There's going to be a lot of things in this version of Werewolf the Apocalypse that are going to be really hard to square with, modern day ideas of what is problematic or not. As bad as the 5th edition version of Vampire the Masquerade they put out was, which is still, for the most part, recognizably Vampire the Masquerade, at least. In the long terms, I just kind of have issues with how they've spread some of the other clans out amidst a variety of different source books where, like maybe you don't need or want a whole book about what Chicago is going to be like for your vampire game, but for completionist's sake, you got to get those La Sombra stats. I hate that kind of shit. And so, how are they going to split up the tribes of werewolves? Are we going to get all 13 basic tribes in the basic core rulebook? Half the tribes are themselves, in concept, extremely problematic, just as equally problematic as the Metis. A good chunk of the werewolf tribes, in particular, are European culturally, shall we say. Several of them are real, hard up, in particular about maintaining ethnic purity, as much as the complaints about vampires symbolically, talking about blood and soil kind of stuff. Well, werewolf doubly more so. And then, also, taking out the Metis, then what exactly is the mechanism that keeps the werewolves from just breeding with werewolves and making more and more werewolves? What's the thing that forces them to have kinfolk amongst both wolf and humans? Are they going to change that entirely? Different human populations distributed across the planet during archaic times had different kinds of flora and fauna around them. Not every culture in the world has any particular attachment or association with wolves. This is in part why we had the Fera in the older versions of Werewolf the Apocalypse, because you could still have large were-cats and were-crocodiles and were-whatever and all other different parts of the world, so everyone could feel representative by having a person of every ethnicity be able to turn into some sort of raging kill machine. I don't know. I don't have very much faith in what Renegade Studios is going to do with Werewolf the Apocalypse. But just in terms of the Metis themselves, I love tragic character scenarios, doomed characters that have a severe flaw to overcome, characters that have social problems, and, the Metis have all that in good quantity. But, don't want anyone to think that there's some sort of disadvantage of living life with a disadvantage, or that somehow this is some sort of cosmic punishment from Gaia. The thing is that it's not a cosmic punishment from Gaia. Gaia doesn't give a shit if two werewolves want to fuck each other and have a kid. The thing with werewolves in this setting is that they are half spiritual creature. They are not entirely just beings made of flesh. And when you crosswire two of those together, it's too much for the physical body to deal with. The mutation is not caused by Gaia's loathing or anything like that. It's just too much spiritual energy trying to interact in one mortal form, causing that kind of just innate disruption upon conception. But let's cut that out. So we're gonna have a game where you have Hominids and Lupus. Are they going to be able to have the Black Furies around? I guess the Black Furies are going to have to start accepting trans women werewolves amongst their numbers. Bongnars, you'd think would be positive, but are they making fun of the homeless people? We better take them out. Children of Gaia, they might keep those around. Maybe they'll probably keep the Red Talons. We'll definitely not have anyone. No one's going to touch the Wendigo or the Uktena. Those tribes are pretty much intact. But the Get of Fenris. We can't have neo-Nazi werewolves. Silver Fangs, well, we definitely can't have Russian werewolves. What the fuck? The only thing worse than the neo-Nazi Get of Fenris has to be the Russian Silver Fangs. But, since they're Ukrainian, maybe the Shadow Lords can now be the ones in charge of the Western Concordiate. We'll definitely need to, beef up the numbers of stargazers, because, they'll want to be able to use them to combat Asian hate. The Silent Striders. I don't know. What are they going to do with those? Are they going to lean into the Egyptian thing? Or are they going to just make them just like a generic African werewolf? We'll just have to wait and see. The Fianna. They shouldn't be overlooked. Whereas, the Silver Fangs and the Get of Fenris, are like uppity white people. The Fianna, how long are they going to be able to coast on all that Irish potato sympathy? At some point, they're just as guilty of white werewolf guilt. I don't know, man. It sounds like it's not going to be a fun time for anyone, and it'll be one of those books that if you get it, it's mainly just so you can tear it to pieces on the internet, and then have children who don't know any better and never actually experienced the older versions of the games tell you that you're an old grognard racist, so whatever. Welcome to our altered future. I find at times over these long years since I first encountered the White Wolf games, that actually the very first versions of all these books that I had copies of, read, and even played were the GURPS versions of Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, and Mage the Ascension. It was about a year after I'd gotten a copy of Mage as a GURPS game that I finally had enough money to buy the White Wolf version of any of the above. And then just, transitioned over to using the Storyteller system, because it was a lot, more streamlined and did more interesting things than the clusterfuck that trying to make a GURPS werewolf character was. But in truth, when going back and thinking about it, the one time I actually ran a Werewolf the Apocalypse game was the GURPS version of Werewolf the Apocalypse. I would play werewolves in several Storyteller games as a teenager, as well as, some vampire characters, some changeling characters. And I would run Mage quite a few times. I ran Dark Ages Vampire once. I ran a one-shot Changeling Christmas adventure. But most of the time, the bulk of the Storyteller games that I, game mastered was for Mage. But I very much loved Werewolf, and that was typically the characters I would play the most. The tribes I tended to kind of hang on were Stargazers, Silent Striders, and the Fianna. Stargazers, the first werewolf I ever played was a Stargazer. I agree with the concept of them as the wisest tribe. The one, a group of werewolves that has made a concerted effort, to focus themselves and not allow this rage to constantly control them and dictate their choices. Instead, they are trying to master themselves and their rage through an act of will. Good luck to them. It doesn't seem to have done them too much favor, though, in the way the actual setting plays out, because they're small in number, largely disregarded by the other tribes. By the time of, Werewolf Revised Edition, the third edition, the werewolves had basically, kind of soft-kicked the Stargazers out, / the Stargazers themselves had kind of kicked themselves out of the Western Concordiate, but they never really seemed to get really adopted into the Hengeyokai. The Haken Shadow Lords were more part of Hengeyokai Beast Court Society than the Stargazers were. And, because of the various mortal forces that had now taken control of, their ancient Himalayan homelands, they were kind of, a people without a place, and just not quite enough of them. There's a lot going on in all that makes, just for kind of a wonderful tapestry to base a character out of. A lot of tragic elements and kind of quiet nobility. Plus, you get to be a badass shape-shifting Shaolin monk. Silent Striders, I only played that once, and it was in a game at a game shop, so it was just kind of like a random assortment of dudes. I was like the youngest kid there. It was mainly like a bunch of adults. Didn't really feel like I was really all that welcome, and didn't really get to do much, but the character concept I thought was neat. Basically, my idea was he was from the kind of like a time traveler Terminator ripoff a little bit. or he was someone who was thrown back in time during the apocalypse to try to change something, and so like his consciousness is hurled back into himself, Wolverine and Days of Future Past kind of stuff. Except upon, like coming back into his earlier version of himself, as a starting level character, he can't remember what the fuck it was that he was supposed to do, and so that way you can have the concept of someone who's been witness to the apocalypse and has all this great fear of this thing that's coming, but doesn't have any specific details that like nail anything down that the game master has to deal with, or that dictate how the campaign is supposed to unfold. And if the game master had taken more interest in that, and perhaps if it had been a smaller group, if it wasn't just a random game of random people at a game store instead of an actual purposely tailored, intimately put together gaming group run out of someone's home, maybe there's certainly stuff in there that a game master could use to build things around of their own devising and all that, but unfortunately that never came manifest. The werewolves I ended up playing the most was a Fianna named Dirge McIntosh, who was a recurring character in a couple of different role-playing groups that were doing live-action Vampire the Masquerade and Werewolf the Apocalypse at that time, both in Austin, Texas and in Boulder, Colorado. And I don't know, I just, at that point, I was, was like post-Braveheart, so I was like really leaning into, like what amount of Scottish ancestry I have and all that kind of stuff. And so, like Fianna Pride and all that kind of shit. Dirge was a Galliard, and I just like the name Dirge McIntosh. Rolls off the tongue interestingly. Dirge is a, good, kind of like odd name to give to a musician type, wandering bard type character that has a kind of a dark side kind of edge going on to it. Plus, also, it's a subtle nod to a classic Decepticon from Transformers. So anyway, like, those are the werewolves that I personally have the most actual experience playing back in the day. In modern times, I probably favor different ones, but, that is the sort of thing that age does to you as you grow older and your perspective alters. So I have spoken already about the 5 Geru tribes that I consider to be the largest impediment to the greater efforts that the Geru profess to have in terms of trying to save the world. This time I'm going to talk about the 5 tribes that I feel in different ways are the most kind of grounded in the lives of common humanity, and probably, in their own ways, the best set up to survive in the long term. The meek among them. I mean, obviously you can't talk about the meek tribes without bringing up bone gnawers, first and foremost. They are the other side of the 2 urban tribes, whereas the Glasswalkers walk around trying to imitate vampires and, live among and infiltrate the upper echelons of human society. The Bone Gnawers are scavengers who live on the edges and outskirts. They breed and live amongst the poor and the homeless. They originated in North Africa, not Egypt, but west of Egypt, so that would make their original ancestors people like the Berbers or Numidians, or possibly even the lower caste levels of Carthage. They're like the children of Gaia, and that they've largely kind of jumped away from those ethnicities in the millennia since their inception. As cities spread around the world, Bone Gnawers followed them, and so they just would kind of just breed it in with whatever the local population was. They're very much, as a tribe, kind of reunited and strongly identified themselves with the idea of America and the American dream. And like low key, despite the fact that like they're of the 2 tribes on this list that gets derided the most by other werewolves, and kind of by extension by the player base of the game, they have one of the largest populations, and they're not disloyal to Gaia in the same way that the Glasswalkers are. They're also more genuinely interested in being heroic, and like standing up for the little people, and not necessarily being the sort of like ravenous monsters that the more wilderness-dwelling Geru tribes tend to just kind of slide towards naturally. Hand in hand with the Bone Gnawers, you also have to bring up the Children of Gaia. They originally came out of Mesopotamia, but like the Bonars, they spread with civilization, and you find them in pockets all around the world, having, like bred into like a lot of different local populations and all that kind of stuff and so on. So they don't really have a particular ethnic identity of their own anymore, unlike some of the other tribes. They're the peaceniks. I personally myself argue that of all the tribes, they're probably the ones that should be in charge of things in terms of coordinated efforts. However, they're a bit too soft-spoken perhaps, and so it's always, comes down to basically a wrestling match between Silver Fangs and Shadow Lords over who gets to be top dog. I feel like their role and things is vastly overlooked, much like the Stargazers. They show like more wisdom and control over themselves, wanting peace amongst the tribes so that they can all focus their efforts better, like is not the same as like wanting to lay down arms and declare a truce with Pentax and the Worm or anything like that. So their effectiveness as warriors and all that is not diminished. Like as I've said before, it doesn't matter who the fuck you are, shapeshift into Krynos form, suddenly you're a killing rage machine. The Uktena I would put on this list. They are the southwestern Central American descended werewolves, sister to the Wendigo tribe, who's like kind of more of a Canadian, Northeast American, Pacific Northwest kind of group. They've spread their breeding lines further out, whereas the Wendigo are, adamant about trying to maintain like pure Native American bloodlines. The Uktena have been more open-minded about mixing with a lot of the races that had once been subjected during the colonial period and all that kind of stuff. So you'll find Mexican Uktena, Black Uktena, all that kind of stuff. They're very spiritual in nature. They still carry, they still are at their core Native American, tribe and philosophy and all that, very like Pueblo, Navajo. So in some ways, like from an outsider point of view, like people would almost view the Uktena as being a bit more civilized than the Wendigo, perhaps, although that's, based on some bad distortions of things. But, because they're not as narrow-minded as the Wendigo, their traditions have a better chance of being preserved forward in history, because they're not so uncompromising on who they're willing to, pass the torch on to. The important thing is that they maintain their tribal obligations to keep a bunch of powerful ancient evil entities bound up in a bunch of wards that they had established a long time ago. And so in many ways, it's important for them to not allow themselves to die out just because they want to stubbornly attach themselves to one particular human ethnicity or another. Speaking of human ethnicities, then we'll lead the last two are both derivatives of the old British Isles. The Fianna, an Irish tribe of werewolves that has also kind of filled in some gaps left over in England and Scotland in particular, because of the other tribe I'll bring up in a minute, especially in terms of like the American story, or really you just look throughout the course of human history. The Fianna are supposed to be the tribe that kind of mirrors the Celtic groups of humans from ancient pre-Roman Europe and on through modern history. And the story of the Celtics is one of a very long, slow decline from once being very widespread to being ever more pushed into, the western corners of the continent and then eventually the Isles. Before able to, join in the great human migration over here to North America and South America, where now they have a much larger gene expression in terms of descendants than they actually have in the places that were once, long time ago, their homelands. Because of that, the Fianna are like a very American tribe themselves, many of them with like Scots-Irish or Irish ancestry. And, so they come with all that kind of stereotypical baggage in terms of like what kind of werewolves they are, with all the Celtic knot tattoos and wearing tors and being, ribald, bar-hopping minstrels and all that kind of shit. You get that out of the Fianna, but, they're common man's blue-collar kind of werewolf tribe, unlike some of their contemporaries like the Silver Fangs or Geta Fenris or Shadow Lord. And then finally, I'll also bring up the Black Spiral Dancers. The original Scotsmen, before the people who currently call themselves Scottish moved to Scotland. The Picts are the ancestors of the Black Spiral Dancers, And yes, they're the evil tribe, but, I mean, does that, and it also, especially in context of the World of Darkness setting, make them quite embedded and aligned with the nature of humankind? They're oft overlooked for the role they do still play in like the active story of werewolf kind. They're separated out a bit too much. Whereas, you can do things with them like, have a player character's actually really the last white howler, and you got the black spiral dancers coming after him, and all that kind of, classic 90s storytelling. I feel like in and of itself, like, the Black Spiral Dancers, like, can have a redemption arc without having to, like, somehow be magically reverted back to their pre-corruption form. So anyway, though, there you go. There's the 5 meekest of the werewolf tribes. So I figured I'd talk a little bit about Hengeyokai and how they kind of fit into the greater scheme of things in the setting of Werewolf the Apocalypse. I feel there's a bit of a blind spot in how the game kind of presents things in a way, because so much of it's focused around the 13 tribes of the Western Concordiate. Because they cover so much of the planet's territories, you get the implication that they're just the Concordiate. But, it's there in the name. They're the Western Concordiate, which implies that there is somewhere out there in another direction another alternative Concordiate, and that is the Beast Courts, the greater collection of the various different kinds of shapeshifters that are the Hengeyokai, driven by the fact that the first release that came out for the Year of the Lotus books, being Kindred of the East, and how the Kuei Jin differ dramatically in origin and form from Western Cainite kindred. It kind of carried forward this idea and impression that, like, everything that came out of the East Asian books would be radically alternative takes on, the standard, format of supernatural creatures we were used to with the other, various World of Darkness titles. And yet, like Mage really didn't have much anything. They had their Dragons of the East book, which just focused a little bit more on stuff like the Akashic Brotherhood and the Euthanatos. Like, Eastern philosophy was already built into Mage in many ways. They did have alternative Kithane for Changeling. There was a bit of difference in how really they just kind of perceived the hierarchy of the underworld and the Dark Kingdom of Jade. But Charon and the Jade Emperor could basically just be the same person. And in fact, there's a lot of figures throughout the World of Darkness that are like talked as if they were separate beings, but they're probably the same. Set is Cain, and therefore, in a way, Osiris is actually Abel. Just depending on your cultural framework, you'll name these people different things, and so on and so forth. The thing with the Eastern Concordiate and the Hengeyokai, and perhaps in part why they've been relatively stable and not, running around the world destroying each other and taking over territories that weren't originally theirs, is that the Eastern Concordiate has kept its shit together. The Western Concordiate is the one that flew off the rails and had the War of Rage and tried to wipe out all the other shapeshifters, and then one by one over the centuries since has slowly been turning on their own, one at a time. The White Howlers fall and become the Black Spiral Dancers. Croatan, admittedly in their case they sacrificed themselves, but had they survived, they would have been, just as under attack as the Wendigo and the Uktena had been. At least their tribes were salvaged, and and eventually there is some basis of a truce, at least amongst the werewolves of the different bloodlines. The Bunyip were wiped out. They were totally just a last gasp of the War of Rage, because the other werewolves didn't really know how to deal with marsupial werewolves. And, they drive everything else into hiding. They're lucky that the Korax and the Niuisha might occasionally talk to them, especially the Korax, I guess, because they're the least affected. Wolves and ravens have always been friends. But, they fucked up. Whereas in the East, they just, stuck to what they're supposed to do. That all the different, types of shapeshifter, has their role to play, including the werewolves, but, they're not necessarily in charge any more than any of the others. In fact, more often than not, it seems to be, they're were-crocodiles and they're were-sharks that, seem to have some of the most prominent positions. Perhaps the Khan, the were-tigers. There are wolves in that region of the world, but, they're not as, fixated at the top. They do include in the basic Hengeyokai book, information on, the samurai shadow lords called the Haken. that are found in Japan. I felt like there also should have been a bit more inclusion about, what the Bongnars and Glasswalker counterparts are like there. These are densely populated areas that have had cities for a long time, so you would think that, that being the case, they would be hotspots for the werewolves that have abandoned the wilderness and largely live in city environments. And yet, they're more American and the way that the game overall presents them. I've always felt that was a little flaw. But, really, the beast courts are what the shapeshifters are supposed to be like, where they're all in balance and in alliance with each other for the greater effort of, protecting, the sacred places and all that kind of shit, yada, yada, yada. Captain Planet. The werewolves have fucked everything up, and as I've said in other videos, I kind of feel like, really, in a way, they are ultimately responsible for the apocalypse that they are about to face, because they are the ones that through their arrogance have thrown, their own kind off balance by taking out so many of the other types of Pharaoh. Their impergium of humankind having driven humans quite willingly into the arms of both Worm and Weaver, further, threatening to destabilize the balance of the triad that keeps Gaia nice and healthy. And they continue to be arrogant and stubborn up to the very bitter end, as it were. The werewolves are just as much villains and monsters as vampires are, and changelings and all the others, demons, mummies. More than any others, they pump themselves up and delude themselves into thinking that they are heroes. The problem with the conversation about environmentalism in this country and abroad, and I use the word environmentalism, not climate change or global warming. Environmentalism is just a political movement based upon some scientific trends that should be addressed, considering if we want to be able to continue with this habit we have as a species of passing our civilization forward to further generations. Using terms like global warming and climate change and the way that those terms are used has turned it into a apocalyptic, almost religious event, shifting environmentalism into some sort of almost techno-Gaianism, pseudo-spirituality, mingled with elements of the New Age movement and feminism and a couple other little grab bag of what used to be more obscure hard-left sub-factions. Have all kind of been bundled together now. And it's been corrupted. It's been captured by corporate politics, and I don't trust it. If we really wanted to save the world in terms of environmental damage and wanting to reverse somewhat the amount of carbon we've dumped into the atmosphere, it's not through recycling plastic. It's through abandoning the use of plastic entirely. It's not by switching to windmills and hydroelectric and nuclear in favor over using coal-fired electric grids. It's unplugging ourselves down to just minimal electric use, if even that. Let us not forget that all these troubles began when we started trying to wire the entire world together. I can imagine a political cartoon. I wish I had that kind of drawing skill to do, your classic newspaper, New Yorker political cartoon kind of style thing. But I can picture it in my head, where, it's you got a scientist or an engineer, maybe kind of a combination of a scientist and a monopoly man business guy. Standing next to the Earth, it's just kind of floating over there. And it's covered in all these buildings and machinery and chugging factory smokestacks, and there's all this smog and dirt and filth around it. And he's showing it off to some other guy, and he's like, isn't this fantastic? Look at how efficient this is, making everything, and look at the productivity. All these people aren't just sitting around scratching their ass, eating bananas off the ground they did originally. No, and now they're building buildings and roads, and they're getting shit done. They're making mad stacks of cash and getting all the pussy. And then the guy's like, okay, that's pretty cool and all. It's kind of dirty, is there anything we can do about that? I'm noticing it's making, some of them sick and all that. And the dude's like, well, don't worry about that. If it keeps running, eventually it's going to clean itself up. It's like, yeah, but should we just unplug it? No, that would make things worse. We need to just keep letting it go, and eventually, entirely on its own, it's just going to magically just turn green and stop doing all this stuff. That's horseshit. If we really wanted to, quote-unquote, save the world, we would just go back to humanity's natural setting. We'd be like a horticulturalist slash, slightly agrarian society, spread relatively evenly out across the landscape without these big megacities. We wouldn't really have capitalism or communism. There'd be a little bit of money, but, only like the feudal lords who are, kind of making sure everyone stays organized and on task, are going to have any real, need for, trade exchange on that kind of level where you need money because of abstract stuff. On the small level, people are mostly just kind of be subsistence farmers, trading with their neighbors and, giving over a chunk of their crops as they're able to the people at the top who will then, trade for things from other lands and distribute the bounty of what they gain down to the little people. Sounds horrible, doesn't it? But, that's what we're supposed to be living like, without cars and concrete roads and electric power and all the requirements of electric power. The majority of the environmental damage that we're doing would be halted. We would still have a massive handprint on the environment, though. Since we've discovered agriculture and started farming, we've started to change the environment on the small scale. Each and every individual farm is re-landscaped and adapted for farming. And when you keep putting farm next to farm, next to farm, next to farm, until eventually it stretches across an entire continent, well, you've just changed the environment for that entire continent now, haven't you? All without having to dump extra petrocarbons into the atmosphere. Now, admittedly, I am mistrustful of the weather prediction aspects of some of the science. We can barely trust what our weather apps tell us is going to happen later on today. So our ability to say what's going to happen 100 to 200 years from now is both abstract and quite likely wrong. Just the predictions that I recall hearing and as a child in the 1980s about where things are supposed to be right now, they haven't quite come to pass. That being said, our sensor equipment is not just making shit up. We can record the materials that we're putting into the atmosphere. And to what degree that might cause things to warm or cool kind of doesn't matter. This planet's environment in that fashion has been all over the place throughout its very long and human-free history. In fact, you can almost argue that the planet's biodiversity was at its greatest during those periods where it had no ice caps and maximized amounts of shallow water oceans. Under those circumstances, and considering that this is a slow process that's not going to happen overnight like some Roland Emmerich movie, the people who are the most affected by, rising coastlines and stuff like that are people who own property in cities and other areas along those coastlines. Everyone else is going to have more than enough ample time to move if need be. The real problem with all this stuff that we're putting in the atmosphere, beyond the fact that it can give us cancer and just other host of other little problems, just on the surface level, no matter what your belief system is, poisoning the air and the water, you don't need it to be anything more than that to sell people on not doing that. You don't want to breathe or drink poison. Duh. One would think, of course, also, we are a species that likes to drink alcohol, which is a toxin, so, maybe we do like to be poisoned, who knows? We certainly like all of our comforts and tricks and gizmos. We like having entertainment on tap. We like our communications devices. We like being able to listen to music. We like being able to have light at night. We like having air conditioning in the summer, and we like having heat in the winter. To some degree, if we were to suddenly unplug everything and shove everyone back out into the wilderness with this many human beings on the planet, how fast would we decimate all of our forests? Within a couple of years, I would imagine, just for the drive to get firewood so that everyone can, not freeze to death night by night. And those large portions of the planet that do get a wee bit nipply in the evening during half the year. There's lots of impracticalities, to some degree, like there's this thing, comedians like Doug Stanhope and others, like make jokes about how the world would be better off with less human beings and all that kind of stuff, which, may or may not be true. We don't actually know what the maximum capacity is because we don't have anything to compare it with. But, you'd end up making yourself the worst villain of all history in order to be able to actually do anything about that. That's not, completely inhumane. No, the problem really is just the fact that every time in history there's been a large spike in, carbon particles in the atmosphere, often caused by outgassing from large amounts of volcanic activity that have erupted from occasional time to time, is that often, right afterwards, the oceans get all acidic and you have a massive die-off that creates this whole big, great chain event through the whole chain of life. Doesn't kill everything, but it kills a lot. So, whether or not we can get through the rest of our lives relatively unmolested, whether or not our children and grandchildren can get through the rest of their lives relatively unmolested by climate change, on some level, are we comfortable with, all, as a generation, most of us dying, kind of wondering whether or not we've murdered the planet 1,000 years from now by our decisions today? But no one proposes the hard things that would need to be done to actually do anything to save it. The companies aren't telling us to, don't unplug your television and stop buying stuff. You need to keep your television on. You need to pay your power bills. We want everyone living in the city so that we can milk as much money out of them as possible. Using money as kind of like this whole carrot stick thing to keep people on this hamster wheel so we can build infrastructure. Just gotta keep building infrastructure. It's what we need. We gotta get more concrete. Don't you know we're almost out of sand because we've made so much fucking concrete? We need more. Find something to pulverize so we can make more concrete. No, we're not actually serious. No one's saying just unplug everything. They're continuing just kicking the can down the road. Get rid of gasoline, okay. You're not saying get rid of cars, I notice. In fact, you're trying to encourage us to buy even more expensive cars that require giant batteries that require just as much rare earth metals that arguably do more damage. It's one thing to poke a hole in the ground and siphon up some liquid that's way down deep under there, but strip mining, oh, that's a glorious thing. There are whole segments of West Virginia that used to be tall, high mountains, and they've been pulled down until they're nothing but big, steaming, blackened, toxic pits, all for the sake of powering our PlayStations and our lawnmowers and our oscillating fans and all these other little things that are great and make our lives so comfortable and poke this weird dopamine hit thing that's going on in our brain about all sorts of little things. It makes things so comfortable, and it makes us feel like we're all fancy and superior to every generation of human beings that's ever walked this planet. Those primitive bastards. Primitive, pre-civilized humanity was not primitive. There's no such thing. We've never found wild human beings that had no clothes, no tools, and couldn't speak. We're all civilized. What we call primitive are just the human beings that were still living naturally. Return to the 3rd century BC and the very dawn of civilization in Pax Luporum, Werewolves of the Republic. complete with campaign setting sourcebooks for the island of Sicily and the island of Lesbos. Now available as a collected starter kit edition. Available now on Amazon.com and Drive-Thru RPG.